Everyone, my name is Andy Jones and I'm at Liverpool John Moores University, and the title of this talk is Breaking Up with SPSS. Can we get students and teachers to move away from point and click when we are teaching and using statistical methods? So the remit for this talk was to kind of give you my experiences of teaching both point and click and command line interface statistical tools in psychology students, and what can we do to move students away from things like SPSS and towards R. So in the presentation, what I'll do is I'll give a brief introduction of myself, and I'll look at the current usage and trends between the different software packages, both in terms of psychology teaching and also in terms of later employability for our students. I'll then discuss what I think are the costs and benefits of using SPSS and R for our students and for teachers if you are a teacher and looking to take that leap from moving from SPSS to R or another command line statistics package. And throughout, I'll try and give some worked examples that I've used in my teaching and when writing a book to try and improve students' understanding and to show how we can teach R to relatively digitally naive students. So who am I then? I am a reader in health risk behaviours. I was trained as an experimental psychologist, and I've taught research methods and stats for about 10 years now across all possible levels for students at a UK university. So I've done foundation courses, I've done undergraduate courses, master's courses, and I've taught PhD students too. So a disclaimer I often use when opening my undergrad courses is that I, at undergrad, was just not good at stats. So you can see my transcript here from my first year undergrad course, and my two worst marks were in research methods and statistics 1 and 2. So I averaged around a 2-2 in them modules, and I honestly didn't get much better in second year. I did not become particularly competent at research methods and statistics until PhD level. Now, part of the reason for this, I think, is that I was taught by a pure statistician. So in psychology at my university at the time, one of the faculty members of psychology didn't teach research methods and statistics. It was a statistician. So it was formula heavy and very theory heavy, and it was very off-putting to me as a wide-eyed psychologist who didn't really see why I was learning research methods and statistics. But like I've mentioned, I've hopefully turned that around a little bit now. This year I have a book coming out where we look at a practical guide for data analysis using R and SPSS. So essentially in this book, one of the aims we had was to give people who read it a practical walkthrough of how to do statistical tests in SPSS and then the same statistical test to try and get the same output in R. And we've kind of framed it in a way that it's not as difficult as you might think. I've also developed courses for online learners, so Kaplan, statistical courses taught completely in R, and I have been funded on projects for statistical related things by the World Health Organization, Public Health England and the NIHR. So I'd like to think I've turned it around a little bit from my underwhelming performance at undergrad to now. Of course, there's always room for improvement. Today, or in this talk at least, I'll focus on two software packages. I'll focus on the two dominant software packages, at least in psychology teaching in the UK from what I'm aware, and that is SPSS and R and RStudio. And if you're not familiar with either of these, SPSS is the capitalist license, so you pay for SPSS. If you are at a university, it's unlikely that you'll pay. It's more like your department or institute will pay a pricely sum for the experience of using SPSS. This is completely different to R, which is free and open source, so anyone can download R and use it without paying anything. The biggest difference to students and researchers alike is that SPSS is a user interface. So it's very much point and click. It's got command menus where you click, I want to do a t-test, and it'll take you through the command menu. RStudio is text-based, it's essentially learning a language. So in order to do a t-test, you have to write some lines of code that will tell you how to do that. That will tell R that you want to do a t-test. There's very limited flexibility to SPSS. It is a pay-for system, and you get precisely what you pay for in the software. The real beauty of using R over SPSS is that it is very flexible. There are thousands of packages made by altruistic people who put these packages online for free and allow you to do all manner of different statistical tests. Another key benefit I find for R and RStudio is the graphics. So the graphics in SPSS, so if you want to do a figure for your paper or for your lab report, if you're a student, the graphics are very basic. Whereas in R, you can create some absolutely amazing graphics. You can create GIFs, animated graphics, maps. All of this can be done in R, whereas in SPSS, you will be left with a very basic bar chart a lot of the time. In line with the continued development of open science in psychology and beyond, it's very difficult for to reproduce things in SPSS. It does use syntax, but largely most people don't use it this way, whereas it's very RStudio and R and RStudio has very good reproducibility because it's script based. You can basically hand over your script to someone and ask them to reproduce your analyses. There's other things that I won't go too much into, but R's constantly updated, whereas the updates in SPSS are few and far between. They make cosmetic changes every year or two, and then add new statistical tests every now and again too. That being said, obviously that slide was me giving a glowing recommendation for R. But currently, the state of things in the UK psychology teaching is that it's still largely taught in SPSS. So this was from 2 or 3 years ago now. A study just basically looked at what was available when describing online curriculum, and in Russell Group universities and non-Russell Group universities, the difference between these two things, if you're not aware, is the Russell Group universities are the research-intensive universities in the UK. Both of them are just still dominated by SPSS teaching. I imagine if we replicated this again in 2025, there would be a couple more, well, I know of a couple more Russell Group universities using R for their primary statistics teaching, but dominant is still definitely SPSS. This is mirrored in research papers. Unsurprisingly, if we teach upcoming scientists to use SPSS, it's likely they will use SPSS in their research. So in 2021, the majority of research papers used SPSS. 2024, which I think this study was largely studies related to nursing, SPSS is still the more dominant software package. But you'll note, again, there's a greater emergence of R as well as we move along the timeline. So R is catching up. So this very nice resource, R Bloggers, has basically examined the number of articles published with different data science software. So the two most prominent are probably SPSS and R. And again, SPSS is still the more dominant one, but if we look on the change over time, this graph here, we can see a increase in things like R and JASP, which is a GUI that runs R in the background, and a massive decrease in things like SPSS. So there's a shift going on where more and more people are moving towards these text-based softwares for doing their statistical analyses. So what's it like outside of academia then? Similar patterns emerging. So I used to use this information in one of my undergraduate introductory stat slides from 2021, and the idea was just to show the students that the skills and the software they are using will improve their employability. So I took this job, which had a decent salary at the time, and it was a public sector job. And you can see within this person specification, they wanted some experience in software packages, and one of them was SPSS. Fast forward 4 or 5 years later, similar public sector job, similar salary, although eroded somewhat by inflation. You can see within that person specification, we don't see any SPSS. So jobs in the public sector are slowly moving away from SPSS, particularly within things like the Home Office in the UK. So the Home Office introduced the analytics workbench, and this is a analysis tool which incorporates largely script-based languages, so R and Python. So SPSS is being phased out of Home Office and public sector jobs. And if you look within the Home Office data science campus, a lot of the training that staff in these jobs get is data science in R. What about the private sector then? So back to this R bloggers post and R for stats. Well, they did a literature search of jobs on Indeed, which might also capture public sector jobs, but largely the number of data science jobs on Indeed which mention R is a lot greater than what mention SPSS. There's almost 10 times as many jobs in the public and private sector that use things like R and Python, which are text-based languages, compared to SPSS, which is this user interface. But why is SPSS still so dominant in academia then, given that what are the shifts in what employers want? Well, I think there's a couple of reasons, and the first one is almost certainly legacy. So it's almost ingrained in the culture now. It's been used for decades. Most senior academics, I think, in UK, and at least the ones I've spoke to, were largely taught SPSS. It's been the dominant program for so long. So the people who've been taught SPSS are also now the ones teaching SPSS. There's some evidence of kind of natural selection. So this paper here was based on the natural selection of questionable research practices, if we were to bring in the kind of open science aspect of this. But the way teaching and supervision works is we pass down heritable traits that increase the survival, in this case the employability of the next generation. And the traits that we're passing down are essentially, well, I know how to use SPSS, and it's benefited me in my career, so I'm going to pass this down to the next generation. And some of it is certainly almost just down to resistance to change, right? So the beauty about teaching research methods and stats is you don't have to update your course materials that much. The theory behind the t-test has not changed in hundreds of years, so that certainly doesn't change in my slides. Whereas if you do a shift in how you teach your statistics, and you have to use a different package which has a different way of working, then all your course materials are going to have to change. So I'm not accusing every person who teaches research methods and stats as being lazy, but if someone said to me, you don't have to change your teaching materials, then that is quite a nice thing, and I can focus my resources elsewhere. So a quick interim summary so far then is that SPSS is still dominant in teaching, less so now in employability. So the trend suggests that we are slowly moving away from SPSS, and it's important to do so if we want to train the next generation of students to go on and be employable in academia, but also in the public and private sector. So we do really need to break up with SPSS and move away from the pointy clicky user interfaces to more script-based languages. So let's look at some of the issues with teaching students statistics then, and how these issues might lead to barriers in the switch from things like SPSS to R. And I think the key issue, particularly for psychology students, is the experience of statistics anxiety. So statistics anxiety is basically that. It's just the anxiety about learning and applying statistics and being assessed on it. And it's very common in psych students, particularly in the UK, where there is estimates of around 80% of students will experience statistics anxiety. Most would choose to drop it from the course as well, but obviously in the UK you can't because it's a key requirement for course accreditation by the British Psychological Society. We can assess statistics anxiety and examine it in research. So the statistics anxiety rating scale is a widely used scale which includes two very interesting statements when assessing statistics anxiety, and these statements often give me and my students a good laugh. And it's statistics teachers are so abstract they seem inhuman, and most statistics teachers are not human, which is a lovely way of describing us, right? So despite its prevalence, statistics anxiety might not all be bad. So in a recent study, we looked at the effects of statistics anxiety on academic outcomes. So we measured stats anxiety at the beginning of a course, and we found it to be negatively associated with how well the students thought they'd do. So students with higher statistics anxiety predicted they'd do worse on the course, but actually we found that statistics anxiety was positively associated with test performance. So the students who had statistics anxiety at the start of the course actually perform well. So there's no denying statistics anxiety is an issue. It's prevalent in our students, but actually experiencing some anxiety around statistics might lead students to perform better. And then we ask students we try and assess what students want or like from their statistics teaching. So these studies by Rode and Ringel have essentially randomised students to receive our course or SPSS course materials. So in these studies, students signed up to a course, which was an R course or an SPSS course, and then they were given a exercise which either used R or SPSS. So there's some crossover. Students who decided to enrol on the R course might have been given SPSS activities to conduct, and vice versa. And what they found was that students who enrolled on the R course and had R software used enjoyed the course, whereas students enrolled on the R course and had to do SPSS did not enjoy the course as much. They also found that there wasn't much difference in anxiety around the course materials, depending on whether they had the R course or the SPSS course and used the software and outputs from R or SPSS. So interestingly, despite them being completely different ways to analyse data in R and SPSS, it doesn't seem to impact the students' statistics anxiety, which is important. So let's move on and look at the costs and benefits of these different softwares for our students and for teachers then. So let's start with the main benefits of SPSS. So SPSS is a graphical user interface. So what that means is it's generally pretty intuitive, and the reason for this is that most of the interactions we do with computers are through graphical user interfaces. So to record these slides, I did not go into the Mac terminal and try and open QuickTime Player and PowerPoint. I simply clicked both them icons in the application window. I used the mouse, I went to find an icon, I clicked the icon, I interacted with the computer, and here I am. So by teaching SPSS, we're not massively deviating from the way students have typically interacted with computers to find resources and so on. It also looks a lot like Excel. So they're not terrified when they open it, and there's a smaller learning curve. If they enter data in Excel, then they can enter data in SPSS pretty quickly, or they can learn to do it pretty quickly. And I think this is one of the key benefits we still see with SPSS is the smaller learning curve. And others have suggested that the deeper the learning curve doesn't necessarily benefit novice and occasional users of statistical software, so they won't see the returns to a steeper learning curve. And if our students are only getting taught research methods and statistics maybe once or twice a week and not doing it in their own time, then they may not see that benefit of a more deeper learning needed to get over the learning curve in R. As I've mentioned, the data input and analysis occur in the same software and window. And SPSS covers the most common statistical tests, at least from my experience as someone who teaches psychology undergrad. It covers all the necessary tests for test of difference, t-tests, ANOVAs, things like that, and test of association, correlations, regression. And they're the kind of tests that we're largely familiar with in psychology and will help them or equip them to do their own research in a final year project or whatever. And at least in later versions, it has moved towards making our students' lives easier in that we get APA-style tables now reported. So there's an ease to use for SPSS for sure. Some of the downsides that have been noted then is, well, the first one is simply that neurostatistics are unavailable in SPSS. Shockingly, the button for effect sizes was only introduced 3 or so years ago. A lot of statistics will not be covered, and I'll show a slide on this a bit later on. Others have noted that SPSS often produces substantial output, requiring users to engage in a quest to find the values of interest. And this is certainly true for things like complex ANOVAs and repeated measures ANOVAs. So the greatest statistics anxiety, I believe, comes from opening a multiple independent variable complex ANOVA, which will give you an output that looks a little bit something like this. And I can see the life drain from students' eyes when I show them something like this. But actually, to report on that ANOVA, the majority of this information is not needed or redundant. We only take a few lines of numbers. Similarly, another quirk of SPSS is when you do pairwise comparisons, it will repeat them. So it basically duplicates the table. In this instance, we've got an independent variable internet usage with 3 levels. It will compare level 1 to level 2 and level 2 to level 1, which is essentially the same numbers, but with a minus sign in front of it. So what it does is it increases the amount of information on the screen for students to get lost in and become anxious over. The other downside is there's just very little flexibility with SPSS as well. Outside of what is available in the command windows, you can't get without using add-ons. So things like Python and R can be added on to SPSS. I mentioned the capability, so someone else has gone through and basically compared the different types of statistical analyses that you can do across the 5 probably most popular software packages, so R, MATLAB, SAS, Stata, and SPSS. Looks like R is the reference category here because essentially everything is available in R, and if it's not available in base R, it takes about 10 lines of code to generate it. And you can see SPSS is actually, in terms of availability, is the most sparse. So there's a lot of things that are not available in SPSS that are available in competing software packages. Now, in defense of SPSS is a lot of these things I certainly wouldn't be teaching at undergrad psychology level, and a lot of these things I've actually never heard of myself. So it might be horses for courses in this instance, where SPSS, it does have the coverage you need for undergrad psych. If you are not teaching undergrad psych, then maybe SPSS definitely isn't going to hit all the boxes you need in terms of the types of statistical tests you need to do. So they were the main kind of costs and benefits of using SPSS. But what about the main benefits for R? Now, I've separated this into the main benefits of R I see for students, but also for teachers. So one of the main benefits, which I think I have touched on briefly, is its employability. And I think this will continue to be one of the largest benefits for undergrad teaching moving forward, as more and more of the public and private sector move away from things like SPSS, which is cost prohibitive for them, especially if they can use free open source software. Then by continuing to teach SPSS, we're not helping students' employability. And there's a nice quote here from, not from psychology for a change, but from ecology, is that the majority of students recognise the importance of using our statistical software and computer programming for their future careers. So the students are aware that R will help their employability skills. Other benefits for students for certainly are just learning code. So as we become more and more data saturated society, more and more data related jobs are becoming available and you need to learn to code. So R teaches you a specific way to code, which is a lot more transferable to other types of programming languages like Python, like C++, compared to what you'd learn in SPSS. When you learn to code, you will come across lots of errors and need to learn how to solve problems. So engaging in coding basically increases you finding errors, which is a normal part of coding, but will also mean that you have to engage in problem solving and critical thinking, things that we also should be teaching anyway, but through coding you can make it a bit more explicit. Another main benefit is for sure the visualizations. So I'm going to show some examples of this on the later slides, but things like R and Python, the visualizations you can create in these for presenting your data are so much better than things like SPSS. It's also free. This is a massive benefit for students, particularly if students are required to pay. Now, for the most part in UK universities, they have a site license to SPSS, so if you're a registered student on these courses, you shouldn't need to pay for SPSS because you've got a site license. But like I mentioned previously, I've done some work generating course materials for Kaplan. Now, they didn't have a site license for SPSS, so their requirement was that these course materials needed to be provided for students in free open source software. So obviously R was a great choice for this. And the wider benefits are we are moving within the UK to opening up our curriculums. So we can do this much easier if we are not behind a piece of software that requires people to pay for it. Another benefit is a massive integration with the open science movement. Again, I'll touch on this in a little bit more detail. And another benefit is simply the performance, not necessarily the coverage of the statistical tests of R compared to SPSS, but just have you ever tried to open a large file in SPSS and had to sit there or go and make a cup of coffee whilst that file opens? Sometimes I can open SPSS without a file, make a cup of coffee and come back up to my computer and it'll still be opening, which you don't seem to have them performance related issues in R. So some of the ones I wanted to go into a little bit more detail are visualizations, and this is where you can show a clear benefit to students over one piece of software compared to another almost immediately. So this is just an example of the same data shown in the SPSS chart builder versus a package called ggplot2 in R. So it's exactly the same data. I spent about the same amount of time creating these two images, believe it or not, but you can see just by looking at them, there's no contest to which is the better and more informative image. I actually find the SPSS chart builder to be awful and take a lot longer because it's just so fiddly, and it's one of these instances where a graphical user interface doesn't work very well when trying to spruce up a chart. So visualization is so much better, but also what I find very interesting is some of the resources people use or people provide for free in relation to R. So a big tip, I think, to get students to want to move away from things like SPSS and towards R is to show them things like this. So this is a YouTube video which shows you how to recreate charts that they'll see in the news, on the Guardian online, or in this case I think it was the Wall Street Journal, that can be recreated in R. It's a walkthrough, it makes it very easy, and you can also tie this into employability, right? Because they might want to go into journalism, might want to go into graphical design. You're going to find it much harder, and you're going to be at a greater disadvantage to do this if your only experience is the SPSS chart builder compared to things like ggplot2. Even things like ggplot2 are set up in a way where you can create themes, such as the theme for the Wall Street Journal, to make your graphs look like they came from the Wall Street Journal. So I think this is where some of the benefits lie, in a sense that it's very quick to show the benefit. The benefit is clear and obvious, and it can be related to other benefits such as employability. Another one which I think will become more and more important over time is the integration with open science movement. So open science should be the norm. And I think in psychology, the reform has worked in a way that it's becoming more and more the norm now. So what we do should be open source, it should be collaborative, and things like R are integrated within the tools of open science much better. So if you look on things like the OSF, where people host their R code, so there's an example of mine here, you can actually see the R code in OSF without having to download it, which is brilliant. But it also allows students to go on, get R code, get the data file, and recreate the analyses they see in a paper. So it's a really good, I find this a really good teaching tool, not necessarily for the undergrads, but for master's students, where they can go in, recreate analyses, hopefully look at people's annotated code and see the decisions they made, see what the code does. And what you're essentially getting here is, by other people sharing their data and code, is another teaching experience. But even within students' own work, it makes it easier to share their data and code. If you annotate the code, it allows you to keep a record of the decisions you've made and why you've made them. And it fosters better work habits, better teamwork, and easier collaboration as well. That's not to say reproducible code in SPSS doesn't exist. And another way I think of getting students to move from SPSS to things like R is to open up the SPSS syntax and show them. Now, not many people do this because of the graphical user interface, but behind all that is text-based code, right? So if you click paste on any statistical test you do in SPSS, it'll generate the syntax for that, and you can use the syntax window to highlight it and run the analyses. So it shows that although it's wrapped in a nice graphical user interface, behind it is text-based, language-based analysis. And then I said one of the things I can do is essentially show them that this bit of code here and this bit of code here do the exact same thing. One does it in SPSS and one does it in R. And actually, there's more lines of code to do the same thing than there is in SPSS and R. So related to reproducibility then, we've got things like collaborative class projects. So this is, I think, a benefit to both students and teachers, in that we can have groups working collectively on projects and collectively on R scripts with version control using things like GitHub. So again, this paper from Farrell and Carey in 2018 highlight the benefits of this, in that sharing your annotated code through the repositories such as GitHub and things like Open Science Framework, it teaches collaboration and communication of ideas in ways that are not possible with like spreadsheet-based software, so things like Excel, SPSS. You can have a team, so a small group, for instance, can work simultaneously on the same code with version control. And as a teacher, you might consider using the R scripts themselves as part of the assessment, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a minute. So what are some of the benefits of moving to R then if you are a teacher? I think one of the key benefits is related to how easy it is to simulate data in R. Now, data simulation, for me, I use a lot for examples. So I create example data sets. Particularly when we were writing the book, the idea was to create example data sets that had some degree of humour about them, Um, when we teach psychology students, it's such a broad subject that it encompasses things like I do, which is research onto healthy eating and drinking, but a lot of the students might not be interested in that. So I don't just want to use data that I've collected to analyse real world data. I also want to use fun or humorous examples as well. Now, have you ever tried to just create a data set in Excel and make sure it has the parameters necessary for, let's say, a t-test where you might need to have data that is normally distributed? If you have not tried to do this, I suggest giving it a try by just trying to make a normally distributed variable by just typing in numbers. It's very difficult. So what R does very well is simulates data sets with known parameters. So you can use functions like rnorm and binorm. So rnorm will create you a normally distributed variable. In this case, the example creates me a variable which has 100 data points. The mean of the variable is 10 and the standard deviation is 2, and it will have a normal distribution. So if I create two of them and change the mean to 15 for the other variable, I can create a t-test then by comparing them two variables. Binorm creates a binary variable. So in this case, it will create me, again, 100 data points, and it will give me a bunch of zeros and ones with 50% 0 and 50% 1. There's also the excellent faux package, which will create fully simulated data sets rather than individual variables. So I've used these extensively in the past to create examples for books, for examples for teaching. But also you can use it to create specific examples in your lecture to show things like normal distributions, for instance, and how a normal distribution um, becomes easier to visualize as the sample size you're drawing from increases. So from this line of code here, this shows the power of R. This code here creates a set of, simulates a bunch of variables ranging from 10 samples to 1,000 samples, increasing in size by 10 each time. So as you can see here, the sample size increases, normally distributed, and then applies a histogram to it and creates a GIF that just shows how the normal distribution improves over time as the sample size increases. Now the beauty of this is you can provide this code to the students and they can change it if they want. So they could change the sequencing, so they could change it up to 10,000. They could make the steps not 10 but 1 if they wanted. If they want to change the colour and stuff of the histogram, very easy to do by changing some of the variables there. So it lets them change the code and see how the code looks as well. Another example I use often is comparing using a histogram to using a p-value test to determine whether a data is normally distributed or not. So eyeballing versus p-valuing the distribution. So in this instance, I've basically used a very similar function there. So rnorm, I want 1,000 data points. The mean overall should be 0 and the SD is 1, so a very standard normal distribution. I create a histogram to examine the normal distribution, but also a Shapiro-Wilk test, which essentially takes your distribution, compares it to a normal distribution, and if the p-value is statistically significant, suggests your data is statistically significantly different from normal. Now I know the data should be normally distributed because I've simulated it to be normally distributed. The histogram to me looks pretty normally distributed, but by running this enough times, eventually I will get a Shapiro-Wilk test which should tell me a different story. In this case, the p-value for this Shapiro-Wilk test is not normally distributed based on this data here. And I can use this as an example to say to students, it's often somewhat subjective as to whether data is normally distributed or not, because the eyeball of this histogram suggests to me that it's normally distributed, but the p-value here suggests it isn't. So what are some of the downsides of R then? Well, it was invented for and largely mostly used by statisticians. So if you're not a statistician and maybe a psychologist like me, it does seem less intuitive at first. So you'll spend a lot of time Googling or chat GTPing what error messages mean or how to do specific things. It's got a much steeper learning curve, or people suggest. So people have tried to plot what this learning curve might look like for different software packages. And you can see ours is the most unpredictable and the steepest are MATLAB, which are two text-based coding ones, compared to SPSS, for example. However, we shouldn't inflate this learning curve. We shouldn't conflate this learning curve, for the learning curve for actually learning statistics as well. So when we talk about this learning curve and related to students, we're teaching them statistics at the same time. And many students, at least in my experience of psychology, don't have any experience in statistics. So their learning curve comes from that as well. And maybe if we try to disentangle the two, actually learning how to work with R wouldn't be that big of a learning curve if you weren't also including statistical learning as well. And even if the learning curve is steep, hard things are worth doing. You'll probably get much greater benefit in the long run by exposing yourself to learning R the hard way compared to, say, learning something like SPSS, especially for things like employability. And other people have argued this the same way. So these are two quotes which I think are the very hardline view of looking at the learning curve. And while I largely agree with the quotes, these aren't quotes I'd maybe present to my students in the first instance. So the first one is, just like any tool aimed at professional use, R requires people to spend time actually mastering it. Just like you wouldn't want a casual carpenter coming in and doing your carpentry, or a casual electrician coming in to do the wiring in your house. You don't want people being a casual user of R, you probably want experts. Second one, actually I see it as part of my job to inflict R on people who are perfectly happy never to have heard of it. Happiness doesn't equal proficiency and efficiency, and in some cases, the proficiency of a person serves a greater good than their momentary happiness. And I guess these are both coming at the same thing, where if we expose our students to R early, even if the learning curve is harder, the learning curve is steeper and it is harder, they will get greater benefits out of it in the long run. I just wouldn't be trying to frame it in this hardline view when first exposing my students to R. Another key issue is almost certainly related to error messages. So if you haven't used R yet, you start using R, you are going to come across cryptic error messages. And the idea is, I think, that the increased flexibility you get from R leads to increased unpredictability, and the people who contribute to the development of R have said, obviously the best error messages tell you what's wrong and point you in that direction to fix the problem. However, it's very hard to write good error messages because it's usually related to how the user is engaging in your function or whatever. And with this increased flexibility in R, it must be difficult to predict what the user's trying to do. And a good example of this, where you get a cryptic error message, is simply creating a data frame with two columns, one that says 1, 2, 3 and one that says 4, 5, 6. We give them column names education and ethnicity, and the data frame is called prob1. And then if I simply ask for a crosstab table between the column of education and the column of ethnicity, I might use something like this: table, the first column, the second column. Now if I do this and run this code, I will get this error message saying all arguments must have the same length. But actually the issue with this, or the most primary issue with this line of code, is it's simply not case sensitive. So the column name is education, but I've tried to call a column name education with a lower case E. R doesn't recognize it, so it suggests they don't have the same length, when in actual fact the column I'm trying to call does have the same length, it's just not case sensitive. So in this instance, a better error message will be, are your variables case sensitive? But obviously that wouldn't work for every possible iteration that could go wrong with this code. So making that switch, you will get frustrated by error messages, but again, this is where Google becomes your friend. Another issue is related to version and package control. So a lot of base R is very stable, although I'll give an example in a minute where it isn't. But if you use packages, and that's where the increased flexibility comes from people who are creating packages for you to use, you are kind of at the mercy of their guidance and how they create the packages and their kind of help documents. So I had this issue recently in a stats package for power analyses, and basically I couldn't quite get the code to work. So I just emailed the person who wrote the package and asked what the issue was, and they said it was a typo in the vignette of the help documents. So many people might have seen them help documents, not identified the typo, and ran an incorrect power calculation. So in this instance, it influenced my power calculation by a couple of participants when correcting it. And this is in no way a criticism of the person who wrote the package, because actually I've found that people who write these R packages are very helpful and get back to you almost immediately, and rectify the situations or give you guidance on what to do. But in this instance, if it hadn't been spotted, a potential issue might have been my power calculation would have been wrong. So I said base R is kind of stable, and that's where you don't install packages and use the inbuilt functionality. Now it is stable until it isn't. So a much bigger issue I've come across recently is when we wrote our book, we tried to use base R as much as possible to rely on that stability and make sure the book was relevant and correct over as long a period as possible. However, during the last phases of publication, I identified that some of the code I'd written for a t-test wasn't working anymore. And it turned out the people who write R decided to fix an error that was first identified in 2010 and had been going on over time with discussions. And the error is quite a significant one. It's related to how R stacks data for paired samples t-tests. And if there's any missing data, it will give you a different p-value. So what they did to fix it was completely change the code. But what that means now is the code that's been published in books and things is no longer works with the most updated version of R. So in the book that I taught myself R with, which is a fantastic book by Andy Field, Discovering Statistics Using R, you will find if you use the code in that book now to do a paired samples t-test, it will no longer work in an updated version of R. So even when you expect R to be stable, there's still a chance code might change. Whereas it's probably less of an issue in SPSS. The GUI might change in terms of the cosmetic aspects of it, but the underlying functionality of click this to do a t-test won't suddenly break. This disclaimer probably should have come sooner, but hands up, my hands are up, and if it wasn't for COVID, I'd probably still be using SPSS. And I guess the point I'm trying to make here is what COVID did is it provided me with time and space. The lockdown compared to, and not having kids at the time and not having to homeschool and things like that, give me more space to focus on things. So I spent a large part of lockdown not doing online quizzes, but trying to learn R. And the way I made the jump from R to SPSS was basically said to myself, I'm going to write my next paper, my empirical paper that had data completely in R and provide the code. So I put pressure on myself to learn R to be able to present the paper and the code online. And I'm also not an expert. I basically know enough of what I need to be able to do what I do, whether that be teach or whether that's to do analyses. And if I need to learn something else, I will learn something else. I don't know the ins and outs of R. I don't write my own packages. I just kind of know what I need to know to teach it and use it. So where did I find the biggest learning curve when I set out? And it was basically, for me, I think it is the R environment. So it's not having the data open next to the commands and being able to input data directly in, like you can in SPSS. You can do this, but it's a real-time sync. R opens data, holds it in the environment, and then you use functions to call parts of that environment and apply things like the mean, etc. to it. I was very put off at R for how long it took me to basically rename a variable. which I could have just done by double clicking something in SPSS. And it's overwhelming how many ways you can apply to do the same thing. So in this instance here, I'm not the only one. So this example is basically how many different ways you can ask R for the mean of a vector called X in my data. All of these different things will give you the mean. There are middle grounds though if you're not ready to make that jump just yet, and these two software packages, JASP and Jamovi, are fantastic. They are graphical user interfaces that use R in the background. And the beauty about them is you retain a lot of R's functionality and flexibility while also being able to navigate to the tools you need in a more familiar graphical user interface. So Jamovi is a very good one for this. It looks a lot like SPSS in terms of its command windows, but what I really like about it is there's also it shows you the R code, and you can also apply R code in Jamovi to do things as well. So it's kind of like that middle ground between going from a pure graphical user interface to a pure command line software package. It meets in the middle and kind of gives you the best of both worlds. So if you are looking to make the leap and don't think you want to go straight to R, I highly recommend something like JASP and Jamovi. Both of them are very similar. They also look very nice in terms of graphical user interfaces too. I guess my final point then is I've focused a lot about the benefits for students for using or moving to R rather than something like SPSS. But I don't think it's the students that we always need to convince. In the UK, we do a lot of big team teaching. So on my research methods and statistics module, for instance, I give the lectures, but then we do practical classes, and 12 members of staff take one of these practical classes because the cohorts are big. So we need everyone on the same page. So for me to switch to R, I need to ensure all the staff who deliver the practical classes are familiar in R. And not necessarily in my institution, but I mentioned earlier that we are very much ingrained in SPSS, and a lot of older academics, for instance, use SPSS and don't want to learn something new. So I think to accelerate the shift between SPSS to things like R, Python or whatever, we need to convince other academics as well, because the students see the benefit of R for their employability. So the barrier is not just, let's say, a steep learning curve for students. It might be for other academics who have to contribute to modules that don't know anything about R as well. And again, like I said, the only reason it works for me now is I had a significant period of time and space where I could devote to learning R and getting over that steep learning curve, if you will. So to summarise then, I guess the aim of the talk was to talk about my experiences of SPSS and R and how I've utilised the move myself, how I've tried to do it for students while highlighting the benefits and not for the student learning experience, but also for me as a teacher. Started off and noted that SPSS did used to hold a dominance that was much clearer. It's still the majority, but R and Python are slowly taking over within academic settings, but also in the public and private sector for jobs. So there's been this slow culture shift of moving from these graphical user interface to more text-based languages, and that culture shift has been very similar to the adaptation of open science, and these two things do go hand in hand a bit because R and Python facilitate open science a lot better than things like SPSS did. Largely because they're open, they're free to use, things like that, and they integrate well with other open science systems like OSF and GitHub. I've tried to focus on how we get students to move over. So if we want to engage our students and get them to move from R, I would focus on things like the employability aspect. Show them the jobs, show them the data science jobs, show them academic jobs that want R now more so than SPSS. And the transferable skills related to problem solving, related to things like visualization. So really focus on what R does better. So things like making pretty graphs, integration with other systems you might use as a researcher, like Open Science Framework, GitHub. One thing I'd love to do is never show them the SPSS GUI to begin with and just focus solely on R. And I think when I've developed the Kaplan course, it's worked pretty well. So what they don't know, that maybe doing a t-test could be easier because you don't have to remember the code for t-test, and you can basically do it by trial and error by clicking through command menus and a GUI. So I wonder if that would be a way to do it, was just to phase SPSS out completely. And then I ended on a caveat really that maybe it's not, the real barrier to adaptation might not be a resistance by students, it might be a resistance by other members of staff on the teaching course and so on. So I think all that's left for me to do is to say thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to discussing this more with you guys. If you want the slides and the R code, you can follow this link here, and I will see you all soon.